Now, campaigners have called for a moratorium on cuts to special education services in Hackney. The local authority is being taken to court over plans to reduce its special educational needs budget. Cuts the council blames on demand outstripping government funding grants. While our reporter, Bhavani Vardi, has been to meet some of the families fighting against the changes.
Albie's mum describes him as a beautiful, happy, cheeky little boy who's due to start school in Hackney in September. He's autistic, and that means he's been allocated funding to support his needs in an educational setting. Despite this, his parents have been unable to find a suitable primary school place for him next term because they've been told by the schools they've approached there isn't enough funding.
The first thing they bring up is funding. We haven't got enough funding, or we haven't got the staff. We won't be able to offer him this support all through the day. We can only offer it to him in the morning. I feel kind of fouled by the borough. He's entitled to an education. Just because he's got autism doesn't mean he shouldn't be allowed to go to school.
Cuts to special educational needs budgets may also affect 9-year-old Romilly, who lives nearby. She's registered blind and is funded for support from specialist teaching staff and has adapted equipment.
If that help was taken away, I would be able to do my work, but I think my work would slightly drop in quality.
We've met with the council, we've had a rally, they know how we feel, and yet they're still determined to make the cuts, not just this year, but also potentially next year as well. We're used to fighting for our children, we've had to fight for them since they were born. This is not new territory to us, and we will continue to fight.
4 different families, who must remain anonymous, will take on Hackney Council in the High Court in the autumn. They'll argue that the council is acting unlawfully for changing the way children with high needs are funded, as well as cutting 5% of funding for children with the most complex needs.
Our clients absolutely understand that local authorities, and this local authority, is under budget pressures. That's the context that we're working in. But the law is clear that when local authorities identify that a child has special educational needs and that provision is needed to meet those needs, they absolutely have to provide it. The resource pressures don't allow a local authority to say that they will ignore legal requirements.
In Hackney, there's an estimated £6 million funding shortfall for services to support children with special educational needs and disabilities in this financial year. But it's not the only borough with this problem. Across London, these budgets have been underfunded by around £100 million last year, according to a survey of councils in the city. The government says the budget for children with high needs is £6 billion this year, the highest on record, and that core schools funding is also increasing, and that Hackney Council itself will receive £42 million of high needs funding. That's 33% more than the previous year.
These are weasel words from the government. The amount of money in the system is nowhere near enough to take into account for the far higher number of young people who've been diagnosed with special needs, and also for the fact that inflation is just going up year on year. After 8 years of the biggest cuts ever to local government, then things are beginning to give in councils across London and across the country. And if the government doesn't step in now with proper funding for local councils, we're going to see services like this lost across the city.
Caught in this tug of war between councils and the government over special needs funding are some of London's most vulnerable children. How can their needs be supported in the current financial climate?
Well, I'm joined now by Chris Kennedy from Hackney Council, whose brief is Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, and by Lisa Kelleher from the campaign group Hackney Special Education Crisis. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Chris, whatever financial difficulties the council has, you have a legal obligation to take care of these children, and it would appear you are failing.
No, we're not. We are taking care of our children. We have been taking care of our children despite major government cuts over the course of the last 4 years. So we had, in 2014, we had 1,350 children on what used to be, under the old regulation, the Statement of Special Educational Need. Now, in 2018, under the new Education, Health and Care plans, we have 1,800 children on those plans. In that time, government funding has basically flatlined. Your report's quite right. We've got 42...
Well, I was going to say, if you look at the film, the families there don't feel that you are doing your job. They think you are failing.
No, they're worried about a 5% cut just on the top-up element of what their child will receive. So every child gets a basic £10,000 of allocation. We're not cutting that. Then we have 5 funding levels from 5,000 to 15,000, and we're taking 5% off those top-up funding levels.
This is fine, lots of numbers, but there is still provision being lost.
We think in most of the settings, the schools will be able to absorb that themselves. And let's be clear about this. The 42 million from your report, yes, we're getting that from the high needs block of the dedicated schools grant. But this year, the figure that was wrong in your report, this year, we're spending an extra 8 million on top of that. And we have been spending more on top of that in the previous years. The fault lies with government. They are not properly funding us.
The figures did come from the council. But Lisa, you've heard what Chris had to say. It's fair enough, isn't it? They are facing huge cuts in central government grants. They're struggling. Something's got to give. It's not fair to blame Hackney Council.
Actually, it is quite fair to blame Hackney Council. I completely disagree with Chris. Schools can't take the burden. They can't take the financial burden. You're talking about head teachers and SENCOs having to make really tough decisions about who gets provision in schools. It's not their remit to make those decisions. They need to be financed to make the decisions.
So what should be cut so that these needs can be met?
We would say that the problem with Hackney Council is very long-standing. There's been a lack of strategic direction over the long term. Hackney was a place you would never send your child to school 10 to 15 years ago. If you could avoid it, you wouldn't go to Hackney. Now, a lot of money's been pumped in. The schools are fantastic, and people will go to private just to get into a Hackney school in secondary. Hackney have been riding on the back of this wave of success. Attainment's been fantastic, outcomes have improved. SEND has suffered in the interim. So when beautiful buildings were being built, you could have leveraged your land to get some SEND provision in there. That hasn't happened.
Is that fair, Chris?
That's very unfair. Attainment and outcomes across all our children, especially our children with special educational needs and disabilities, have been fantastic in Hackney. The problem is that increase in numbers that I talked about that has not been adequately funded by central government. That's where the blame lies.
Greg, central government, 8 years of austerity. You must have some sympathy for Hackney Council.
Well, no, I don't, because actually that 6 billion figure, that is increased from 5 billion in 2014. So that is a 20% increase in government funding for SEN. That is well in excess of inflation over the last 4 years. And there was additional amounts announced on top of that, just in May, an additional 50 million for SEN places in schools. That has also been another important announcement. Yes, we are operating in a tight financial framework due to the,
and as a consequence, failing
problems
children.
Inherited that we inherited in 2010 from the previous government, leaving this country with an enormous budget deficit. However, the amount of money given to SEN has increased by over the rate of inflation by 20% in the last 4 years.
Sarah, I know this is something that you have looked into in your own constituency. What did you find there?
So I surveyed all our head teachers, because people throw numbers around and it's difficult to you need to get the evidence from the teachers, and 85% of the over 50 head teachers that responded, 85% have had to cut special needs provision. And what really it's heartbreaking for parents.
Greg, that's fairly damning. Sorry to interrupt you, Sarah, but that's a fairly damning finding.
Well, look, what I'm saying is the amount of money given by central government to SEN is up substantially by more than the rate of inflation. Councils will often make their own choices about where to put those resources, and that is in many ways correct, because
Sarah.
councils are democratically, locally accountable for those choices that they make.
I think the general election, it was absolutely clear across the board that people were voting on education, because all the parents, all the teachers, everyone sees the impact of education cuts. We've seen this month, the IFS have said yes, absolutely categorically, there's been an 8% cut in overall school funding since 2010. and that's in real terms, it's huge. And that's. But can I just make one extra point, which is that what we're also seeing is a huge increase in exclusions in schools, and half of the kids who are being excluded have special needs. So that is all the evidence you need that the children with special needs are not getting the support they need, which means that it ends up being they're either a danger to themselves or their classmates, there's behavioural issues, and they end up being excluded. And that is absolutely appalling to be happening to children who need support. They should not be in that situation where they're ending up excluded.
Lisa, is that something that rings true for you?
Absolutely happening in Hackney at the moment. Children with ASD whose behaviour is so precarious through their schooling career can't cope in the environment anymore, and parents have approached me and mentioned this, and I've said, well, would you like me to look at your child's EHC plan so I can see, you know, is it adequate?
What is an EHC?
So that's the extra funding that you'll get from the council to cater for the special needs over and above what typical children will have.
And Chris, finally, you guys are headed for court now. You're headed for an expensive legal battle.
And I understand why.
Is there any way that you can stop that happening?
I don't think there is now. That the way that we can stop the disagreements and the problems that we both have great concern about is by being properly funded by central government. You can't change the legislation and increase the age range for which local authorities are responsible and not have a funding formula that acknowledges that.
Lisa, has the engagement failed? I mean, is this actually the problem, that you're not talking to each other?
I think we're talking, but I think we're not being heard, Chris. I think that's our problem, because we seem to be saying the same things to you guys all the time. And that's why we took this action. That's why we went to judicial review, because we've seen early years funding cut massively in the last couple of years. That's the place to pick up a special need and to intervene quickly